11. Union Sundown. When the call came, Ralph Natale reflected on exactly how long it had been since he'd laid eyes on Jimmy Hoffa. Their final meeting was tinged with melancholy rather than the bravura of their initial get-together, a sad coda to a close friendship. Hoffa was reaching out after a run of hard luck and hard times. For more than 4 years, Hoffa ran the powerful International Brotherhood of Teamsters from behind bars in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, with his hand-picked General Vice President Frank Fitzsimmons representing the boss on the outside. Hoffa, after a brutal and bruising legal war with the government, went to jail in 1967 after convictions for conspiracy and misusing the union's pension funds. Hoffa cut a 1971 deal for his freedom, but it came with a price. The veteran labor organizer agreed to resign his post atop the Teamsters and never again serve as a union official. Hoffa was promised, before heading to prison, that his successor Fitzsimmons could resign and surrender the union office once Hoffa was back on the streets. But things had changed in his absence, and Fitzsimmons, with the backing of some prominent mob leaders, wasn't going anywhere. Hoffa was undeterred and began angling to regain control of his union and its top spot.
Fitzsimmons went to see Genovese family boss, Fat Tony Salerno, who told him, "Don't worry about him. Jimmy Hoffa will be talked to and this will be straightened out," said Natale. Of course, nobody kept their word.
The possibility of Hoffa's running for the union's top spot in 1976 soon emerged as his likeliest road to Teamsters' redemption. Hoffa, behind the scenes, contacted some of his old friends to see if such a move was plausible, a clandestine tour to see who was willing to back his play. Natale was hardly surprised by this bold move.
They couldn't change Jimmy. They could tell him what to do, but they couldn't change his manhood. He was a great union leader, and he had some balls. I heard he was going to do this or that.
The final meeting of Natale and Hoffa took place in the Rickshaw Inn, a restaurant with a gold-flecked roof and a huge half-a-horseshoe-shaped bar opposite the Cherry Hill racetrack. A few days earlier, Natale was at the offices of Local 170 when the phone rang. It was John Greeley, head of the South Jersey Local 676 and one of the area's most influential labor leaders.
"Calls me out of the clear blue sky," said Natale. "John says, 'That guy's in town. He wants to see you.' I knew what he means, and I said, 'Oh yeah? Okay.'"
Natale, unsure what to expect, arrived for the 1 p.m. get-together with 2 killers from his crew, Turchi and Marone. The latter a truly terrifying figure who once attended a wedding reception with a hatchet tucked in the small of his back. "Just in case," he explained. Natale figured he was better safe than eternally sorry.
"I never knew when people called me what's gonna happen," he said. "'Cause in those days, everything was comme ci, comme ça. I might have some crazy people want to take a shot at me. I'm gonna go down blazing. I ain't gonna walk into something. In our life, you're only killed by your friends, or people pretending to be your friends. That's our life."
His fears were unfounded. Unlike their previous meeting in Detroit, when the union world belonged to an all-powerful Hoffa and the future appeared limitless, a feeling of impending doom lingered this time.
"Anyway, I went and it was just terrible," Natale recounted. "It's about 1 in the afternoon. It's dark in the lounge. At the far end of the horseshoe, there's Jimmy and John Greeley. Jimmy comes up and shakes my hand. We hugged like men."
The old friends exchanged pleasantries, and before long Greeley excused himself, leaving Hoffa and Natale to discuss the business at hand, the reincarnation of James Riddle Hoffa. Hoffa spoke first. "I heard you've been busy." Natale smiled. And then Hoffa got down to business. "I guess you know why I'm here."
I said, "I hear a lot of things through the grapevine. I'd heard different people telling me about it, people that meant something." He said, "Ralph, I'm going to need some help in Jersey. John Greeley already said he was with me, if I run. And John would. He was that kind of man. Jimmy said, 'The next convention, I'm going to take the thing back by a claim, and I need your help. Would you help me like you always help me?'"
Natale looked directly at the powerful union leader, a look that expressed both his admiration and the dilemma he was now facing. Finally, he spoke.
Jimmy, you know who I was with since I was a boy. Before I was a boy. When I was in my mother's womb, my father was with them, and I'm with them. So let me tell you one thing first. A man cannot serve two kings.
Hoffa offered a wry grin before responding.
Ralphie, I knew you were going to say that.
Unmentioned was the name of Angelo Bruno, who would make the ultimate decision on Philly's support of Hoffa. Natale then offered a biblical reference to his boss.
Listen, if he, like Pontius Pilate, washes his hands of it, says he's not involved in all this stuff against you, I'm going to help you in a minute. I know Fitzsimmons broke his word to you. I was told by 100 people.
Hoffa was expecting the answer, and he knew Ralph's response meant support from the Philadelphia faction was a pipe dream. He looked right back at Natale. I knew you would say that, and I respect that, but I wish you said, if he looks the other way, I'll help you and do whatever you need. The mood turned darker than the dim bar lights as the two old friends sat in silence, their brief conversation signaling with a black future for Hoffa. The implications were not lost on Natale either.
He already knew the answer, but he had to ask me, Natale said. When he said he understood, I felt like I was at his funeral. I could smell the dirt of the grave on him. That's how I felt, right then and there in that room. I hadn't felt up to that time so bad in all my life. Until I looked at him. I'm pretty cold-hearted about these things, but my heart went out to him. He was dead. He was a dead man talking to me. I said, Jim, are you sure? And he said, I have to do this. It's the only thing I have. I looked at this man, who could get killed for doing what he thought was right. And he was right. He was 10 times the man that Fitzsimmons was.
Natale awoke the next morning and drove directly to Bruno's house to speak with the boss about the Hoffa situation. Bruno's wife, Sue, answered his knock and invited Ralph in for a cup of coffee and a few minutes of her husband's time. When Bruno appeared, Natale recounted his meeting at the rickshaw. The boss's response was hard and fast.
You know I love Jimmy, but there's no reason for him to do this. It's wrong. Even if he calls you and says it's an emergency, stay away. That man up in Jersey, Tony Provenzano, is going to take care of this. Please, don't forget what I said.
Natale, as usual, kept his mouth shut and remembered every word. The boss's edict was final, a Philadelphia epitaph for Hoffa's reign.
And I thought, oh my God. It wasn't long after that he disappeared,
Natale recalled. He never saw or spoke to Jimmy Hoffa again. The mighty labor boss disappeared on July 30th, 1975.
I couldn't get over it for weeks. I felt terrible. Oh, I felt bad,
Natale recalled.
And for me, I've seen a lot of things. I've done a lot of things. It bothered me. I respected him so much as a man.
In an odd quirk, law enforcement summoned Natale as they investigated Hoffa's death, asking about their afternoon at the rickshaw. The mob killer was insulted at the insinuation that he was involved.
I said, don't even ask that. I would never do that. You know my M.O. Not with friends.
12. Roll of the dice. Carlo Gambino died on October 15, 1976, without ever seeing his vision for Atlantic City come to fruition or fortune. The old Don, before his passing, had turned control of his eponymous family to his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. The move made sense to Gambino, whose sons were entrenched in Manhattan's garment district. His mob family was considered the strongest and wealthiest on the East Coast, if not the nation. To Ralphie, it was a choice fraught with disaster. The selection was driven by Gambino's greed, keeping everything that he had created in control of his own family, and not his family. His personal fortune would be protected, and he believed Castellano would rule using the template of Gambino's reign as a guide going forward. But many in the Gambino rank and file supported the elevation of respected underboss Agnello Della Croce, creating a schism among the mighty family. The man known as Mr. Neal also had the respect of leaders atop the other 4 families of the Big Apple.
A monumental error in judgment that was to sound the death knell for the family,
Natale observed decades down the road.
He badly misjudged his capo's reactions, and those of the soldiers on the street.
The choice reminded Natale of an old Sicilian proverb. for without the hammer, the nails would still stand upright. Castellano was not strong enough to drive the family nails. The decision echoed on the streets in Philadelphia, too, where Bruno's alliance with the late Don had long provided him with an unassailable ally, an organized crime ace in the hole. Looking back, Natale sees Castellano's rise as the beginning of everybody else's fall.
"It was the biggest mistake Gambino would ever make in his life," said Natale. "Paul thought everything was calm in his family, but greed caused all the problems, in his own family and everywhere else. Paul was a legitimate guy, too. He ran a successful company, Blue Ribbon Meats. His 2 sons were legitimate guys. Everything would be in place. It doesn't work that way. He didn't know what was in these other guys' minds. He didn't read them right. To run a mafia family, you gotta be the top mafioso."
Such concerns were not on the table when Castellano and Bruno, 2 Dons doomed to die before their time, met in the hours after New Jersey voters gave their stamp of approval to casino gambling on November 2, 1976. The late-night supper at Valentine's in Cherry Hill was a time to celebrate a bright future for their 2 families, to toast the absolute power of La Cosa Nostra. As the new Gambino boss, Castellano was there to assure that the decade-old deal between the families was still intact.
"Paulie, great things happen when you have patience," Bruno assured him.
The Las Vegas of the East was now theirs, along with the family in Chicago, the docile Don assured his dinner companion. Castellano, trying to mask his euphoria, reached across the table to touch Bruno's hand in a show of respect. Big Paulie recalled the words that Gambino had shared from his sickbed. Angelo Bruno was a trusted partner and an unshakable friend. His word was his bond. Castellano told Bruno those feelings were mutual.
"Angelo, I will handle everything on my end by myself, with Chicago and the commission, and I will make sure Ralphie receives all the support needed to finish this move."
Not even a threat delivered months later by New Jersey Governor Brendan Byrne could dampen the exuberance. "Keep your filthy hands out of Atlantic City," Byrne warned the mob, already too late in 1977. "Keep the hell out of our state." The mob's vision for the seedy city, with its no-account cast of characters, was becoming a reality. Best of all for Castellano, New York City's 4 other families, the Genovese, Colombo, Lucchese, and Bonanno Borgatas, were on the outside looking in. The combined firepower of Philadelphia and the Gambinos would keep poachers from thinking twice about wetting their beaks. On the same celebratory night, in a bar 2 hours north off the Jersey Turnpike, the first seeds of treachery were taking root despite the triumph at the polls. Tony Bananas Caponegro watched the election returns at his bar Down Neck in Newark, a martini sitting in front of him on the mahogany bar top. Alongside sat his brother-in-law, the made man Freddie Salerno. Both were with the Philadelphia family, and Caponegro was Bruno's consigliere, a trusted advisor. The vote to approve casino gambling stirred only anger and bitterness in the mob veteran Caponegro. For the first time in decades, control of Atlantic City would actually lead to a cash windfall for the Philadelphia family, and now they would share their good fortune with the Gambinos of New York? The thought ate at Caponegro, who nursed a long-standing grudge against Carlo Gambino. Way back when, the ruling commission declared Newark an open city, free for any of the 5 families or the Philadelphia faction to conduct business. The ruling rankled Caponegro, the lookout man for the 2 shooters in the October 23, 1935 murder of bootlegger Dutch Schultz at the Palace Chop House in Newark. He expected, as a reward, to operate as the Don of the city, running his Jersey fiefdom as an independent.
"But it was not to be," Natale recounted. "And he later found out it was Carlo Gambino who persuaded the commission to open the city of Newark."
Caponegro, known for his furious temper, felt the bile rise in his throat as he addressed Salerno with increasing bitterness.
"All agreements and promises should be buried with Gambino when they put him in the grave," he snapped. "We owe nothing to that big jerk-off Big Paul, who is a boss only because of his sister's big ass."
Salerno and the other hangers-on were shocked by the crude remark, but he knew that was the least of his concerns with Caponegro. Salerno sipped his martini and considered all the good luck that had come to him and his friend. Organized crime in Newark was theirs alone, a lucrative mix of gambling, loan sharking, hijacking goods from the nearby docks, and pharmaceutical plants. They kept their stolen stock at a pair of warehouses, like a legitimate retailer, and Freddie was full partner in a jewelry store in Manhattan's Diamond District. Both were, unlikely as it might once have seemed, now millionaires. Life was good, but Freddie Salerno suddenly had a bad feeling. He sat in silence as the venom dripped from his pal's lips. Salerno had good reason to worry about the thoughts running through Caponigro's head. Salerno had worked as the getaway driver on several hits attributed to Tony Bananas, a mob killer through and through. Caponigro, always insisting on pulling the trigger himself, a move that he saw as simple self-preservation. If one of his men did the work and felt the rush of taking a life, Tony Bananas might face a rival for control of Newark.
All the years of watching the life flight leave the eyes of the men that he executed only increased his paranoia that another shooter would find killing as easy to do as he had, Natale said. He was mistaken. Most men kill because they are ordered to do so, and it was also a requirement for induction into La Cosa Nostra. Many of these men dread the thought of ever again being ordered to take a life. Unlike Tony Bananas, this was the power he held over everyone else in his regime.
13. Meeting Mr. Stanfa. One warm spring afternoon in South Philly, Natale swung by Snyder Avenue to visit with the boss. Angelo Bruno had sent word through his business partner Raymond Long John Martorano, who had just moved into a home about 10 minutes away from Natale, New Jersey. The new arrangement allowed Bruno to easily reach out for Natale with no direct contact, his preferred way of doing business. The trip brought back everything Natale loved about the old neighborhood. Blankets, sheets, and bedspreads flapping in the breeze from the second-story windows of the row houses. The new mothers pushing their newborns in strollers down the narrow streets, the sweet smell of the changing seasons in the air. But summer loomed just 3 months ahead with its stifling heat and humidity, and the boss's wife, Sue, had asked for an air conditioner in the kitchen. Bruno never refused his wife and family anything, and this request was quickly granted. Natale had never laid eyes on the man installing the unit, a Sicilian immigrant named John Stanfa. Born in a mountain village, Stanfa came to Philadelphia with quite a backstory. A made man on his native island, Stanfa arrived in New York and connected with his relatives in the big city. His nephew John was already a made man in the Gambino family, and his 2 brothers were major heroin dealers in the South Jersey area. John Gambino asked his own uncle, Carlo Gambino, for permission to find Stanfa a new home in Philadelphia. Stanfa could provide an inside look at the Bruno family, working as a mole to keep New York abreast of developments down south. Stanfa signed off on the deal, so did Carlo Gambino. The family boss made a phone call to Bruno, looking to secure a welcoming haven for the new immigrant. Bruno, as customary among the mafia's dons, welcomed the friend of his friend with open arms. Stanfa launched a small construction company, financed by Bruno. The Philly boss went a step beyond, instructing all in his family to use Stanfa if they needed any work done. Natale, after a light and polite knock, was greeted by Sue Bruno.
"Is the chief in?"
Natale inquired.
"He is,"
she smiled.
"And why are you here so early?"
Natale smiled right back.
"When Caesar calls, I come."
Sue steered him toward the kitchen and the air conditioner project. She raised her eyebrows in mock appreciation of the effort, but Natale knew she was flattered that her husband put her concerns first on this fine day. The 2 men were speaking in Sicilian when Natale found them. Even before they met, Natale bore a natural distrust toward the Zip, a derogatory term used by the American-born mobsters for their Sicilian-born counterparts. Stanfa was 2 steps up a ladder, as Natale eyed him carefully. The 2 men were about the same age, and the same diminutive size. The ever-suspicious Natale waited to see what else he would learn about the man in his boss's home.
"This is John Stanfa,"
said Bruno as the man came down the ladder and toward Natale.
"He's good friends with the Gambinos."
Stamfa extended his hand in greeting. Natale, giving the hand an extra tight squeeze, stared in the Sicilian's eyes. After years of judging men of all stripes under all kinds of circumstances, Natale didn't like what he saw. He decided Stamfa was an ass-kisser, eager to please on the surface, but dangerous at the core. Natale kept his opinion to himself, instead offering a compliment on the new air conditioner. Stamfa soon ingratiated himself with Bruno and the rest of the Philadelphia family, particularly Consigliere Caponigro and trusted capo Frank Sindon. Underboss Testa was among the few put off by Stamfa's obsequious behavior and servile facade. The chicken man proved more astute than his boss, as Stamfa's true loyalty remained with his cousins in New York. Their unbreakable bonds were forged in the heat of their mountainous Mediterranean home, and a trip across the ocean did nothing to break them. They would instead shatter the family at the other end of the New Jersey Turnpike. 14. Something's burning. Natale was now in his 40s, his mob reputation burnished by his work and his future bright, when a legitimate guy, a lawyer no less, approached him about providing a loan for a South Jersey furniture business somewhat bizarrely named Mr. Living Room. The owner would buy his product at a discount below the Mason-Dixon line, ship it north, and slap an inflated price tag on every piece. Natale had the money. By now he was leasing and running a restaurant inside the Holiday Inn opposite the track. The spot on Route 70 had become a hub of mob business and a clubhouse for the Natale crew, and he held court there most every day.
Friends of Mr. Bruno, and anybody who was with me, they made a living there, he explained. You ever play pitching quarters? This is us inside the restaurant. We're not betting enough across the street, so in between we pitch quarters for $20 a game. It was fun. It was like kids hanging out in the neighborhood.
But Natale still jumped at the chance to collect easy cash from the furniture salesman. It was a can't-miss operation, until Natale's future in Atlantic City and elsewhere went up in flames.
The attorney came to me. Nice guy, nice family.
Natale recounts of his ill-fated investment.
He says, by the way, the owner could use a couple $100,000 to buy some furniture. Cheap. I said, yeah, okay. How is he? Good with the payments? Would you stand for him if he missed? He said, sure I would. Okay, good. Couple $100,000 cash.
A meeting between Ralphie and the owner was arranged. Mr. Living Room turned out to be a guy named Sam. The men shook hands, and Natale explained the particulars of their business arrangement.
This is serious here. Make your payments.
Inevitably, Sam did not.
This, that, the weather, this thing,
recalled Natale. The mafioso had a solution to their problem. Arson.
I had a crew, the Hatchet, Ronnie Turchi. Forget about it. It would be hard to find out it was arson. I said, do you have insurance? Let me see the insurance policy.
The policy was for $1 million. A plan was set in motion. Natale immediately declared that he wanted to double the $200,000 loan for his troubles, unless he decided that taking half of the $1 million payout was more appropriate for the aggravation. The only bump in the road, as far as Natale could see, was the guard dog left in the store every night.
I told him, we're going to set this place on fire. Make sure the dog ain't in the building that night, because if the dog's inside, I'm going to be angry,
Natale recalled. The dog was spared, and Mr. Living Room was torched. Everything looked good until an insurance adjuster came to interview Sam, who caved under questioning.
This guy comes up. For some reason there's an argument,
Natale recalled of the conversation that caused his downfall.
Sam says, I think there's been an arson, and I've been doing things with the arsonist for a long time, to the insurance guy. And that was the end of that. That's how we all got indicted. What do I know? He was making money off the arson. I could have rammed my head into a wall. I got 12 years on that, but I was out on bail.
Which gave Natale a chance to visit sunny Florida. On the whole, to paraphrase W.C. Fields, he was far better off in Philadelphia. Good weather and bad luck awaited. The arson bust, while in no way a blessing, was hardly the curse that Natale initially feared. The murders of McGreal and Feeney remained unsolved. An arson charge was a comparatively minor blip on Natale's crooked highway. The initial gut punch of the possible 12-year sentence waned as new business prospects cropped up.
It was a shock. 12 years. Son of a bitch, he said. I got jammed up. What was I gonna do? It wasn't a big deal, not to me, because I thought they knew some of the things that would put me away for the rest of my life. At that time, I would have done 5-6 years. By the time I get into shape, I'll be home.
Natale was out on bail pending his appeal when another lucrative opportunity knocked in the person of his old nemesis, Charlie Allen, accompanied by one of Ralphie's cousins, Raymond Bernard, the son of his beloved Aunt Dolly. Bernard was married with kids and had a penchant for gambling and losing.
A printer by trade, Natale says now, and a gambler and conniver by choice.
The proposal was a money-making drug deal for 500,000 Quaaludes and 10 kilos of cocaine.
I, being the big-hearted man that I am, it's my cousin, right? He said. Money was easy with me. I'm making it, doing 1,000 things. Raymond says, please, Ralphie. And my aunt, she was always good to me.
It sounded promising, but Natale was blinded by the cash and in the dark about his partners. Allen was now in his 3rd year working as a confidential informant for the Philadelphia office of the FBI. He'd agreed 1 year earlier to become a federal witness after his arrest for running a meth lab with Bernard and Swamp Poodle. Bernard flipped too, with both men promised a walk if they cooperated in a sting targeting Natale.
They get a little house in the Irish neighborhood, Natale related. Of course, they're trying to make meth. It blows up. It's very volatile, that stuff. They get fucking caught. The cops say, Charlie, you don't have to worry. They set him up because they thought, we gotta get Ralphie off the streets because of Atlantic City. We don't want him there. Charlie was a rat to begin with. I heard when he came home from Lewisburg, he went to the FBI and said, I need money. I'll be a confidential informant. An agent told me that. And that's the end of that.
Allen handled the introductions of all parties involved. His partners were Drug Enforcement Administration undercovers. Negotiations were done on a 42-foot yacht moored in sunny Florida. Natale was aboard when the bus came down at 6 a.m. on February 8, 1979. He walked off the luxury boat and into a pair of handcuffs.
Where was I gonna be?
He asks now with a sly grin.
A seedy motel?
But there was no denying how sharply the DEA sting, arranged by a blood relative and a mob associate from his hometown, stung Natale.
They set me up, he said, still irate 40 years later. I felt sorry for them. They got caught up in something. I felt pity for them. I went down to Florida. I'm on the boat. Don't worry, the money's there. Boom! The next thing I know, I'm locked up. Forget about it. It was crazy. It really was.
The FBI simultaneously descended on his suburban New Jersey home. Natale, generally a live-and-let-die kind of guy, still nurtures a grudge against one of the FBI agents who kicked in the front and back doors in Pennsauken, where Lucia was inside with 2 of their daughters, ages 8 and 15. The agents waved their guns in front of the trio, who minutes earlier were baking cookies. An agent discovered Natale's cache of hidden hollow points and approached Lucia, who was standing with her younger girl. "That's what your husband does," the agent announced. "These bullets are for an assassin. Your husband is an assassin." Natale's ire rises at the thought.
My 8-year-old. She never forgot that to this day. And my wife just looked at him. You had to say that right in front of her?
A second grudge rose from the arrest. The blood betrayal by Cousin Ray still rankles Ralph.
Jesus Christ, my own cousin. Why didn't he tell me the day before? I can't do it. They're setting you up. The whole world would have changed. Everything would be different, but it wasn't. It is what it is.
The FBI's thinking was simple. Natale, out on bail in the other case, would immediately go to prison once the new charges were known. This would give the feds a chance to lean on Natale with some leverage, working their way up the family hierarchy in an attempt to finally take down Angelo Bruno. The jailing instead offered Bruno's enemy an unimpeded path to take down the docile Don. Natale immediately knew this was a major jackpot. Combined with the arson case, this meant he was facing, for the first time, after 30 years in organized crime, a seriously lengthy time in lockdown.
When I got arrested in Florida, I said, this is going to be a long one for me. But it was everything else but the murders. They all thought I did those, but they had no proof. As the old cowboy says, dead men tell no tales.
Natale made 3 decisions going into the uncharted future. He was no rat. He wouldn't give up shit to anyone about anything. And he was now a vegetarian. As he sat inside the Lauderhill jail after his arrest, the guards brought in bologna and cheese sandwiches for the prisoners awaiting processing. Natale asked for 1 sandwich, hold the bologna, and he hasn't had a piece of meat since. The next morning, Natale was summoned by a corrections officer at the Lauderhill City Jail. 2 FBI agents were waiting to make his acquaintance. "Listen to them," the captain advised. "They're good guys." The pitch was short. They wanted Angelo Bruno, and they wanted Ralph Natale to serve him up on a silver platter. Natale's head was suddenly swimming.
In my mind, at that time, I'm worried about my wife. They went in my house, broke down all the walls, looking for money and guns. They had just grabbed me off the boat. The change of culture, at that moment, you'll never feel that. You're living like a human being, and then you're boom, like a dog.
His priorities changed quickly as the 2 agents started talking.
You want to talk about pressure? They put a list down. Take a look at these names. You recognize any of these names?
Natale recognized them as victims from Philadelphia mob killings. He quickly realized this was more than a simple drug case, and prosecutors from Florida to Philadelphia to Chicago and New York had an interest in his prosecution. The taller of the 2 finally spoke. "Ralphie, we know that you either killed these people personally or with others on orders from Angelo Bruno, Carlo Gambino, or Tony Accardo. All you have to do is become a federal witness against these men, and all of your problems with the law will go away. Tell us who ordered these killings, and you won't have to spend a night in jail." Outwardly, Natale's demeanor remained calm as the agent addressed him. Inside, one thought ran through his head.
These sons of bitches are going to try and bury me.
Natale didn't waste his time or his breath.
You got the wrong guy. Captain, put me back in my cell.
The parting words of one agent rang in his ears. "You'll be back." Natale was convicted on 3 counts, each with a 25-year term, but was expecting a much more lenient sentence on a simple drug bust, especially after dodging charges for his other mob sins. Then prosecutors tried to sentence him under the Dangerous Special Offender Act, putting him in line for a life sentence. Natale, while not surprised, was outraged.
I ain't a rapist, he snapped. I ain't a serial killer.
Back in Philadelphia, Bruno reached out for an old friend, his trusted lawyer, Kossman. The boss and the semi-retired barrister were client and lawyer, but they were much more. The 2 men socialized and played the stock market together.
And said, you gotta go save his ass,
Natale remembers.
He knew they wanted him. They would have gave me anything, but he knew I wouldn't give them shit.
The lawyer, whose clients also included Blinky Palermo, headed south. A special hearing dragged across 3 contentious days with lots of legal wrangling as Natale nervously awaited his fate.
Imagine that, he snaps. I was never arrested, even for an assault. Put me in front of a judge as a dangerous special offender. The prosecutors put in that I did this or I did that, no evidence. After the 2nd day, the judge said, do you have any more? Do you have any evidence? Thank God. Suppose he said, this little Dago bastard, I'll bury him.
Once Kossman worked a little legal legerdemain, Ralph Natale was sentenced to 15 years by a judge who almost apologized for the draconian sentence. The time would run consecutively with the 12 years waiting back north for the Mr. Living Room blaze. The federal guidelines for his criminal convictions were 52 months to 80 months, a shade short of 7 years. He was instead facing 27 years, and Natale was stunned by the severity of the sentences.
Oh my God, they buried me, he said. Wouldn't give me parole, wouldn't give me nothing. I lost everything I had on the street. It cost me all my homes, and it almost cost me my family. I could cry when I think of it. My eyes were full of tears when I went into court thinking about it.
He was shipped by bus, shackled with leg irons, linked to 40 other inmates by a waist chain, and then thrown into solitary confinement. But Natale was nothing if not resilient. He was soon confident he could do the time, and he was pleased to see an assortment of familiar faces behind bars.
When I went into prison, I was held in high regard because of what I did on the street, he said. When I first arrived, every made man treated me with respect.
With his jail time came plenty of time to reflect on life, and Natale pondered what was going on back home. He was troubled by what he'd seen and sensed in the Bruno regime before heading down to Florida after his own pinpoint in time with Charlie Allen. Something about Capo Negro and Sindone made him feel hinky.
Tony was courting Sindone, and through Sindone, John Stamfa, Natale recounted. But if I had said anything to Ange about their sudden closeness at that time, he would have flown into a rage. Imagine anyone talking about his consigliere and one of his most trusted capos.
Time would tell that Natale's assessment was deadly accurate. 15. Angelo Bruno, what has happened to you? With Ralphie off the streets for a good long time, things were changing in Philadelphia, mostly because of the man in Newark, Capo Negro. The festering bitterness inside Tony Bananas bubbled and bubbled until he decided it was time to take action. Natale felt it was no coincidence that the turmoil took place with him imprisoned far from home.
That's what Tony Bananas was waiting for,
he said.
Not that he was afraid of me, but he was afraid I might kill him. He knew how I was. As soon as I heard it, I would know where it would come from. I'd go right to that bar he had in Newark, and I would bring my crew with me. I'd bring the Hatchet, Mike Marone, and Ronnie Turchi, a killer. But Mike and Ronnie got arrested first, a couple of months before me. When I was home, when Skinny was alive, nobody would even look at Angelo Bruno. Skinny would kill him right there. And when they took out me and my little crew, the door was wide open. They didn't wait long. They put it together. They talked to goddamn Frank Sindone. I should have killed him. Another jerk-off. Him and Nicky Scarfo.
The plot to murder Angelo Bruno required the treachery of two mob families in the two cities at either end of the New Jersey Turnpike. While Capo Negro angled to replace Bruno as boss, the mighty Genovese family saw an opportunity to extend its influence in the Garden State, and perhaps as far south as Atlantic City. Capo Negro had surreptitiously reached out to his Genovese equivalent, Consigliere Frank Fonzie Thierry. The unusual request, made only after careful consideration, was delivered in a blanket of secrecy. Capo Negro knew the topic would bring repercussions from Philadelphia to the Big Apple to the outfit in Chicago. The Genovese family was in ascent since the death of Carlo Gambino and the rise of its own powerful leader in Vincent the Chin Gigante, a brilliant mob mind who hid his light beneath a ratty bathrobe and floppy cap. The Chin posed as a mental patient, checking himself in and out of a psychiatric hospital to successfully dodge prosecution for decades. The 1966 pact between Chicago, the Gambinos, and Philadelphia left the Genovese family on the outside looking in when the casinos opened down the Jersey Shore. It also left a bad taste in the mouths of outflanked family leaders, a bone of contention that never disappeared. Capo Negro intended to exploit the situation for his own benefit. His friend and driver Freddie Salerno drove his boss from Newark to the Triangle Civic Improvement Association, the dingy Sullivan Street social club that served as Gigante's headquarters in Greenwich Village. A pair of thick-necked goons quickly steered Tony Bananas inside the small storefront, heavy with the smell of good cigars and better coffee. Thierry was waiting for him. Capo Negro pondered his pitch to open the door for both the Genovese and himself by murdering the docile Don. Thierry led his visitor to a table in the rear of the cramped, no-frills club, where the two men sat at a thick-legged table to talk. Espresso was served, and the two mob veterans began their verbal bobbing and weaving, the conversation like a showdown between two fighters. It soon became clear that Capo Negro was punching above his weight class, and in his bloodlust to fill Bruno's shoes, he seemingly forgot a previous beef over a bookie operation claimed as his own by both Fonzie and the Philly consigliere. The dispute had gone before the commission, and Capo Negro was declared the winner. Thierry, still nursing a grudge, decided this was the time to gain a cruel measure of vengeance and regain control of the North Jersey turf.
Tony Bananas was in his own right a cunning and devious mafioso, said Natale, but not in the class of Fonzie Thierry when it came to Machiavellian tactics. Old Niccolo Machiavelli could have taken lessons from the elder statesmen of the Genovese family.
Capo Negro asked about Boss Gigante by rubbing his chin and asking about our friend, standard procedure when discussing the permanently paranoid Genovese boss who barred one and all from using the name. Thierry offered a half-smile in return before asking, "How are all of our friends in Philadelphia?" Tony Bananas was thrilled when Thierry didn't mention Bruno by name, taking the omission as a sign that he was on the right track. Capo Negro then ranted for more than an hour about the situation in Philly, about the unholy marriage of the Gambino family to his family in Atlantic City. Thierry finally leaned over to respond, his voice a hiss. "Do what you have to do." Those 6 words set in motion a calamitous and cruel series of events that left 3 mafia dons dead in 5 years, dozens of soldiers slain, and 2 mob families in total disarray.
Fonzie Thierry played Tony Bananas like a Stradivarius,
Natale said.
He used Tony's own treachery to anesthetize his cunning and awareness to the hidden Genovese agenda.
Capo Negro and Thierry hugged before the Jersey guy headed home, totally unaware that he was a pawn in a deadly game run by the New Yorker. Tony Bananas, with his steps urgent and his face dead serious, marched toward the big black sedan where Salerno was waiting. "As soon as we get to our joint, call Sindone and tell him we're coming in tonight for dinner about 7 p.m., Capo Negro announced. "Felix and Meats are coming with us, and tell him he'll be drinking champagne after he hears what I've got to tell him." When the pair arrived 30 minutes later at Capo Negro's bar, Down Neck, in Newark, Tony Meats Ferrante and little Felix Bocchino were drinking at the bar. Natale was unsurprised by their inclusion in the plot.
"Well, they were strutting way before the killing, when I was on the street, before I went away. They did little things, hijackings, and then big things. This scheme, that scheme, they were big schemers. Tony Meats was the blood nephew to Tony Bananas, so he became somebody. And Felix was with him, so he became somebody. Eventually, Tony Bananas made them."
Ferrante and Bocchino once went as far as proposing a hit on Blinky Palermo after a couple of business deals went bad. They arrived at the Rickshaw Inn for a meeting with Natale to lay out their plan.
They said, "Ralph, you got pretty close with Blinky, didn't you?" Normally I would say, "None of your fucking business." I didn't like their tone already. But if you respond too fast with men like that, they won't tell you the rest,
Natale recalled.
They said he fucked up a couple of deals, and they were going to kill him.
Natale had heard enough. He looked at Ferrante, and then at Bocchino. Natale rose slowly and leaned in close to his guests.
"If you even breathe hard near Blinky Palermo, I will kill you," he seethed. "I'll kill you right here if you fucking say a word. I'll fucking kill the both of you."
The death threat was enough to scare the pair off. The 2 mobsters survived to plot another murder, the killing of Angelo Bruno. Capo Negro, his team of treachery assembled, set the wheels of his high-wire act of murder in motion. The weapon, it was decided, would be a shotgun imported from Newark, no hardware with a link to Philly. The consigliere feared a stop on the New Jersey Turnpike if he transported the weapon himself, and so Bocchino and Ferrante were entrusted with delivering the gun to Philadelphia. The pair brought the murder weapon to a slaughterhouse on Front Street. Bocchino brought the gun to an upstairs office to break it down, make sure all the parts were in working order, and then reassemble the instrument of death. To Natale, the plot was another example, reminiscent of the late Joe McGreal, of people trying to be something they were not.
They wanted to change their destinies, from common thugs to somebodies,
he reflected years later. That trip required more than a shotgun and a black heart. All sorts of destinies were recharted by the time the Capo Negro cabal was finished on March 21st, 1980. Capo Negro and Salerno traveled south together on their mission, arriving at the Philly home of Capo Sindone just off the first exit after the Walt Whitman Bridge. The front door was unlocked, and the men exchanged handshakes, hugs, and kisses on the cheek. This was the type of respect that Capo Negro craved and expected once Bruno was gone. The docile Don had forbidden such greetings between made men, feeling it was an ostentatious display of what was supposed to be a secret society. The only exceptions were when meeting Goodfellas from New York, where such hellos were de rigueur, and for mob initiation ceremonies. The display in Sindon's living room was a repudiation of Bruno and his ways. The underboss served coffee as the traders discussed the ultimate betrayal of their benevolent boss. Sindon then produced a plate of anise-flavored biscotti, a favorite of Capo Negro as the capo ingratiated himself with the man who would be king. The reverie was interrupted by another knock on the door, and John Stanfa entered. The Sicilian-born mobster was the key player in the murder plot, the linchpin of their evil. It was a particularly cruel twist. Bruno's old friend Gambino had vouched for Stanfa, giving his stamp of approval to the Sicilian, and now he was conspiring to kill the man who'd welcomed him. Bruno had unhesitatingly taken care of this Judas, unaware of the duplicity in his heart. Loyalty and honor, the founding precepts of Italian organized crime, were trumped once more by greed, jealousy, and the heartbeat of blind ambition. Stanfa, unbeknownst to his co-conspirators, had already reached out to his Gambino associates in New York. He was simply following the code of his native island. Promise everyone, but trust no one. The rituals of handshakes, hugs, and kisses were repeated in Sindon's home. Stanfa took things one step further. As if on the set of a movie, he took Capo Negro's hand and kissed that too. "Don Antonio," he said in Sicilian, "I give you my life." It was an Oscar-winning moment, played to the hilt by Stanfa for an appreciative audience of one. Tony Bananas. With the formalities done, the four sat down to discuss the specifics of their plan to murder a man who had helped every one of the quartet during his reign. 16. At 2, Tony Bananas. Angelo Bruno woke up that same morning, kissed his wife of nearly a half-century goodbye, and walked out the front door. It was the last time the couple would ever speak.
"You look so handsome in that blue business suit,"
she told him as he exited, her final words to her beloved spouse. Bruno met with his lawyer pal Kosman for lunch, business as usual. That evening, Bruno headed to Turano's Italian bar and restaurant, owned by none other than Frank Sindon, and situated just 2 blocks from the market. The crowd grew thick as word of Bruno's impending arrival spread, with an assortment of mob wannabes eager for a glimpse of the boss. A nervous Sindon sipped on a martini poured into a coffee cup. Even on the night when he planned to murder Bruno, he did not want the teetotaler boss to see him drinking hard liquor. Ralph Natale sat cluelessly in a Florida prison as the night's events unspooled. Bruno's presence at Turano's was intended to soothe hard feelings within his family. Sindon and underboss Testa had had a falling out over business, and the boss wanted to set things right. Earlier in the day, Testa volunteered to join the 2 men for dinner. Bruno believed this issue was best handled by himself alone, a response that left the chicken man uneasy. Decades later, Natale remains astounded that Testa failed to connect the murderous dots pointing directly at the boss.
"Phil Testa was as dumb as they come," he sniped. "He didn't see what was going on with Capo Negro and Sindon. He should have sensed something wasn't right. If Skinny Razor was around, they all would have been gone before anybody got close to Ange. He would have seen it, sensed it, smelled it. But Testa was a dunce. He was dim-witted. And what happened, happened."
Testa meekly obeyed his mentor and benefactor, who had ruled unchallenged for so long after plucking him from the obscurity of a butcher's shop. "I'll see you tomorrow," said Testa, before Bruno headed toward the car where his driver waited. John Stanfa started the engine and delivered Bruno to the restaurant. Sindon, who had ascended from small-time dope dealer to millionaire during Bruno's reign, hustled across the room when his boss entered through a side entrance. As Natale heard it, Sindon nearly made a fatal error. He started to embrace Bruno, a move guaranteed to set off the careful boss's internal alarm system. Sindon caught himself and instead offered a handshake of pure betrayal. He then led Bruno to a table for his last supper. The 2 men ate and talked. The chain-smoking Bruno went back to his waiting vehicle, lighting another of his ever-present cigarettes. Stanfa would typically lower the passenger side window an inch or two to let the boss's cigarette smoke waft into the night. Instead, Stanfa had let the window down about halfway before they drove through the misty night toward Bruno's row house on Snyder Avenue. The boss never noticed the difference, and the car would soon become his coffin.
He trusted everybody around him too much,
Natale observed with hindsight. Lying in wait was the ruthless Caponegro, who'd decided to handle the execution personally, hoisting himself into the top spot with a single blast from the shotgun that he cradled in his arms. Bruno's car eased into a spot outside the home where the boss had bid his wife farewell only hours before. Caponegro emerged from the darkness and put the barrel against Bruno's right ear. So came the violent end to the docile Don, longtime padrone of the Philadelphia La Cosa Nostra. The sound of the blast echoed across the quiet streets and throughout the world of organized crime. Neighbors and the simply curious rushed onto Snyder Avenue as the sounds of sirens filled the night. Sue Bruno knew what the sound meant, and she wept inside their home for her husband. John Stanfa, imagine the good fortune, escaped with just a few stray pellets in his arm. He was taken to a nearby hospital, with Bruno's body left in the open for all to see inside the car, spattered with his blood. Caponegro climbed into a waiting getaway car, headed for Newark, his bloodthirsty work for the evening now done. Freddie Salerno was behind the wheel.
I waited over 20 years to do it, Tony Bananas reflected. When Carlo died, it was only a matter of time.
Bocchino and Ferrante broke the shotgun back into parts and dumped the weapon into the Delaware River near the foot of the Walt Whitman Bridge. The pair climbed into Ferrante's Mercury Marquis and drove to a pre-planned rendezvous at Caponegro's condo. Only now, when the deed was done, did the consequences of the plot begin to play out in their minds. Sindon, in his dark-colored Eldorado, made the same northern pilgrimage, his ghoulish features awash in the green glow of the dashboard. He rode alone, accompanied only by the promise of a slot as underboss in the new Caponegro regime. As with Bocchino and Ferrante, the fallout from the killing was suddenly in the forefront of his thoughts. The worst of those scenarios. What if Thierry had suckered them all into a Sicilian scam from which there was no escape, at least while breathing? Sindon finally arrived at Caponegro's posh four-bedroom condo with its views of the sprawling New York skyline. The Newark capo was waiting, along with the rest of the plotters, Salerno, Ferrante, and Bocchino. Ferrante asked about the one person missing, Stanfa, who was taken to a Philadelphia hospital and would face a grilling by the feds and local cops.
That zip's got more balls than that whole crew of testers, Caponegro sneered. He knows what to do. Remember, he's the only live witness to what was done.
Tony Bananas poured everyone a drink and made plans to contact Thierry about the pot of gold at the end of their bloody red rainbow. Testa was warming up a leftover veal cutlet when the door of his home in the posh Girard Estates flew open. His son Salvi burst inside, barely able to utter the words that now poured from his mouth.
"Dad, they killed Ange."
The young man could barely breathe as he delivered the news. All the color had drained from Salvi's face as his father stood in their kitchen. The two had bonded as the chicken man's wife battled unsuccessfully against cancer. Her death left father and son living alone in the house with its stone front and welcoming porch. Salvi wanted to deliver the news personally to his dad, but he had another motive for coming home. He wanted to make sure that Phil Testa was not next on the hit parade.
"Who?" shouted the elder Testa. "And where?"
Only then did he notice that Salvi was accompanied by his whole crew of young hoods. The son provided the details. Outside Bruno's house, the cops had left the bloody corpse of the boss sitting inside the car.
"They left him there for everybody to see, the motherfuckers," said Salvi. "The greaseball Stanfa was driving him."
His father spit out his venomous reply.
"That no-good motherfucker. He was in on it, or else they would have killed him too."
Testa then instructed his son to call Nicky Scarfo in Atlantic City and assemble the city's made men at the Hilton Hotel near the old Veterans Stadium.
"Make sure, Salvi, they come loaded," the father commanded as he slipped on a trench coat. "Those cocksuckers really did it."
Before Phil Testa could leave, Chucky Merlino, a Scarfo loyalist, burst into the house. Nicky had sent him to protect the underboss, and Nicky was already on his way to the city. Scarfo's nephew, Phil Leonetti, and Nicky the Blade Virgilio were with him. They were headed for Merlino's home, where his son Joey was waiting for further instructions. A crowd was now gathering outside the home of the presumed new boss, unaware of the machinations that had led to this night. It was as if they half expected Testa to emerge like a politician on election night and deliver a statement. Most fully expected the blast that had killed Bruno would not be the last volley fired by the Philly family, now under the direction of the man inside the house. The first silent shot was fired by Scarfo from a payphone in a rest stop off the Atlantic City Expressway. He pulled a small, leather-bound phone book from his pocket and dialed the number of Bobby Manna, an old friend from the Genovese family in New York. The two had done time together in the early 70s for refusing to speak at a New Jersey hearing on organized crime. A mutual respect and friendship was forged inside the walls of a South Jersey prison, where the two men spent hours walking in the yard and talking quite candidly about their lives and the life. Upon their release, Manna shared this phone number with the Brooklyn-born Scarfo. If little Nicky needed anything, Manna advised, he was reachable 24/7. The Blade, over Scarfo's initial objection, stood guard as his boss made the call. Another pinpoint in time. It was a calculated gamble by Scarfo, as the details of the Bruno killing were yet to shake out. The commission would decide who would pay for the assassination. Scarfo's mind cleared when he heard Manna's voice on the other end of the line. Manna was expecting the call because of Thierry's conniving chat with Caponigro months before. The two New Yorkers saw the Bruno hit as the chance for the rising Genovese family, under the guidance of the Chin, to grab their piece of the New Jersey rackets. The agreement on Atlantic City was now a deal between two dead men, Gambino and Bruno. Manna invited Scarfo to bring Testa with him for a breakfast meeting in New York, 7 a.m., at his place. He hung up abruptly, feeling no need to wait for a reply. The connection to the Genovese family gave Scarfo a leg up on the new boss, Testa, as little Nicky exercised his in with the New Yorkers. Scarfo was already angling to play Brutus to the chicken man's Caesar. Testa and Scarfo were headed to the city before sunrise the next morning. Gambino boss Castellano would send his own man down to Philadelphia to get the lay of the land, unaware that the Genovese family had beaten him to the punch. Word of the assassination soon reached the Federal Correctional Facility in Homestead, Florida, where Natale was held in a special unit known as the Glass House, an homage to a prison within a prison, with walls of bulletproof glass. The space was reserved for mobsters and other inmates deemed high security risks. The first-floor recreation area, with its pool table and television, had closed at 10 p.m. on March 21st. Ralphie had returned to his cubicle and slipped into a restless sleep. At around 11 p.m., Gambino family associate Frankie Verna appeared, his voice as soft as his news was harsh.
"Ralphie, wake up," Verna whispered. "Take it easy. I just heard on the radio they killed your friend."
That moment stayed with Natale through the rest of his time behind bars, and even to this day.
"I could see his face now. He came and told me. I just heard some news. Your friend. I knew who he meant right away."
Natale regained his composure and asked if there were any details. Was anyone seen after the murder? Any arrests? Any details? Verna saw the suddenly angry Natale rise and head toward the prison phones, which recorded all inmate conversations. He urged the hothead Natale to take some time before calling anybody or saying anything that might raise the hackles of those listening to the tapes. "I'll go make some coffee," said Verna. The two men sat in Natale's cubicle for the rest of a long, sad night. A frustrated Natale was unable to strike back at the killers of his friend and boss, even as his mind and soul screamed for vengeance. The impotence was crippling.
"I felt like I wasn't a human being," said Natale. "I couldn't do anything that a man could do. That's how I felt. I called the next morning to my wife."
As the phone rang back in Pennsauken, New Jersey, Natale's mind began racing. His head suddenly filled with the sound and fury of the opening lap of the Indy 500. One name kept surfacing through the confusion: Tony Caponigro. Lucia picked up after just 2 rings, and Natale, without so much as a good morning, began to speak rapid fire.
What are they saying on the TV?
After a quick news update, Natale provided his wife with specific instructions.
Lucia, there are 2 things I want you to do for me. First, call Long John. The numbers are in our personal directory. Tell him to be at the Centani at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Secondly, take
Sons,
Michael and Frankie with you to the wake. Lucia, I'll talk to you after I speak to Long John. Don't worry, everything will be okay.
He hung up without saying goodbye. At 1 p.m., Natale was back on the prison phone dialing the number at the Italian restaurant where he was a partner with the current head of Local 170, Charlie DeRose, who picked up after a single ring. Without small talk, DeRose handed the phone to Martirano. FBI agents had trailed Bruno's longtime sidekick to the restaurant this afternoon.
What a terrible thing last night. Our friend,
said Long John, his voice sounding uneasy to Natale. Martirano, knowing every word was being recorded, was about to declare his innocence in the hit for the unseen listeners who would review their conversation. Natale interrupted, snapping,
Listen, my friend was killed, so don't play silly games with me. I'm in no fucking mood. This is being recorded here, so don't pretend that it's not what it is. Those 2 motherfuckers did it, didn't they?
There was a long pause once Natale had pointed the finger directly at Caponegro and Sindone.
How did you know that from down there where you're at? Asked a perplexed Martirano, setting off an eruption from the other end of the phone. You dumb motherfuckers! Natale raged. Nobody was even near my friend when he died. The shame is on your souls, starting with Testa and Scarfo.
Martirano's explanation that Bruno had asked Testa to steer clear of the sit-down fell on deaf ears.
Jerk-offs, Natale ranted. Why didn't Phil send some of his crew to babysit Ange until he got home? I wonder why not. Well, fuck them all. Somebody's got to pay for this, and if it takes 100 years, I'll make sure of it. Longy, if you hear anything else on this, tell my wife at the wake. I'll talk to you after that.
Natale slammed down the phone, sending a message from Florida. He was unsure of Martirano's role, if any, in the slaughter of their mutual friend. 17. The Wake. Lucia was home on the day of Bruno's wake when the phone rang again. She answered to hear the voice of Bruno's longtime business partner, Martirano. Don't wait in the line at the funeral home, he told her, but come to the front and look for him. Lucia and her sons, Michael and Frankie, would be escorted directly inside, where Sue Bruno wanted a few minutes with the wife of her slain husband's imprisoned loyalist. Thousands of mourners, a mix of family and the family, made men and mob wannabes, all flanked by the merely curious, snaked along the sidewalk outside the Pennsylvania Burial Company on South Broad Street. Inside, the hundreds of floral arrangements included 10 carloads of orchids alone. It was a scene straight out of The Godfather, playing out in South Philly.
There is no wake like an Italian wake, Natale said. It's as if the Colosseum in Rome was open for business after 2,000 years. Here was the wake the South Philadelphians had waited for, a chance to pay homage to their Caesar, Angelo Bruno. This was their chance to mingle with the made men of the Philadelphia Mafia that they read about in the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Daily News.
While the wake had the feel of a once-in-a-lifetime event, the future would prove that feeling was untrue. Lucia and her sons, with Michael at the wheel, were stuck in the massive traffic jam paralyzing the local streets. They finally found a parking space and started walking to the wake, with Lucia showing her 2 sons the old dressmaking business where she once worked as a teen. The mother was dressed all in black, the sons in dark suits with black ties as they grimly approached the funeral home. Long John spotted Lucia and the boys, steering the trio through a crowd that parted quickly at the side of Mrs. Natale. The first 5 rows of seats near the ornate casket were filled with mafiosi as the Natales inched toward the kneeler, where they would say one final prayer for the soul of Angelo Bruno. Bruno's only son, Michael, a man of the legitimate world, moved to bring Lucia to the empty seat alongside his mother, Sue. Mrs. Natale first put 2 fingers to her lips, then touched the slain boss's forehead. A farewell from the absent Ralphie, so furious and powerless in the wake of the murder. Sue Bruno stood to greet Lucia, who softly told her friend to sit. Sue's hands were cold, dry, and trembling as Lucia took them in her own hands. When the 2 women locked eyes, They broke down in tears and embraced. Lucia spoke first.
My Ralphie sends you his heart, and no matter what or who, they will pay. Lucia,
replied Sue.
Just sit a couple of minutes with me until I get myself together, and then I must tell you a few things.
Lucia nodded yes, maintained the embrace, and scoured the room with her eyes as her husband would have done. Standing to the right of the casket was the chicken man, Testa, flanked by his demented followers Little Nicky Scarfo, Crazy Phil Leonetti, and Chucky Merlino. The next generation of the Philly Mafia stood close behind, Testa's son Salvi, Scarfo's son Nicky Jr., and Merlino's son Joey. Lucia was struck with a single thought. These men were the enemies of her husband. And then another one. The men mourning Angelo Bruno were men of no substance, unworthy of filling the docile Don's shoes. Her reveries were interrupted by the sound of Sue Bruno's voice.
Lucia, please don't take this the wrong way, but I must say these things to you. I'm glad your husband is in prison, only because if he wasn't, he would be laid out next to my Angelo. They would have had to kill Ralphie with my Angelo, 'cause if they didn't, your Ralphie would have made the streets of South Philly run red with their blood.
Lucia was somewhat surprised by the blunt comment, as it was the first time anyone had spoken what she knew was true of her husband, her teenage sweetheart, and the father of their children. A weeping Sue warned Lucia that the stunning hit would turn their worlds upside down.
Tell Ralphie that everything would change for him because of what happened to my Angelo,
Sue Bruno declared as tears streamed down her face.
And tell him my family sends its love and respect.
Lucia said goodbye, promising to stop by after the burial. Her two sons kissed the widow on her cheek and followed their mother out past Testa and the rest. As they nodded toward her in a friendly way, Lucia felt the hostility coming off the group in waves, from the pockmarked face of Testa and the ferret-like glare of Scarfo. She went home and booked a flight to Florida for the morning after the funeral. She would tell her husband every word, every detail, every message, both stated and inferred. The words of Sue Bruno echoed in her head, and Lucia knew she needed to pass the message along. The generosity of the Bruno regime would be buried along with the murdered boss. The timing was terrible. Lucia, alone with her 5 kids, was dependent on the cash-filled envelope that had come regularly from Bruno to cover her expenses, with her husband behind bars. The new boss, Phil Chicken Man Testa, cut off the cash flow shortly after assuming the throne. Natale became even more enraged, with his anger extending to Testa's newly appointed underboss Scarfo. He felt the resurrected Atlantic City mobster's influence already seeping poison into the family. Natale, by now transferred to the federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, finally sent a message back to Philadelphia's new mob leaders, expressing his disgust at the decision to leave his family flat. Testa and Scarfo summoned Martirano to deliver their response. He met with Lucia, and Long John nervously repeated the message word for word. "Tell your husband that we can reach him anywhere, even in Lewisburg." The next day, Lucia and daughter Carmen made the 3-hour drive from Philadelphia to the prison. Just as Martirano had, she recounted the 12-word threat. She knew even before Ralph opened his mouth exactly what her husband would say.
"Lucia, call Long John and tell him to meet you tomorrow morning in front of the ShopRite,"
just a short walk from their home in Pennsauken.
"and tell Long John to bring this message back to Phil Testa and Nicky Scarfo. Tell them to do what they have to do, because when I come home, I'm going to see the both of them."
Natale then looked directly in his wife's face before finishing,
"When you're finished telling that scum what I said, turn around and walk away and never meet with anyone again."
Natale's only bit of comfort came from a single thought. Revenge is a dish best served cold. He had 15 years left behind bars, and the thought marinated into an obsession. A plan was already coalescing in his mind, where it would stay for another decade. Natale laid out his plan to Philip Rusty Rastelli, the imprisoned head of the Bonanno family, as they walked through the prison yard.
"Philly Rastelli was a real man. He asked to see me the first morning I was there," Natale recounted. "I never met him on the street. He said, 'Hi, Ralphie, I'm Phil Rastelli. We shook hands through the bars. I was the only guy he would walk with in that yard. Then we get into it a little bit, and he said, "Is it true? You're just starting this bit?" I said, "I can't lie to you, 'cause you're like the men who broke me in. When I get back there, I'm taking back what was mine, because they took what was mine. And they took what belonged to Ange, and they didn't give nothing to my wife. All due respect to you, because I know who you are. I don't give a fuck who says no. I'm gonna do it."
Natale believed nothing short of his own death would stop him from turning those words into reality. Ralph felt that he knew exactly why the Chicken Man, along with his new consigliere, Scarfo, abruptly ended the promised payments to Lucia.
"Why would he fuck with me?"
Natale asked rhetorically.
"He figured I was gonna get buried. I'm dead. Knowing me, knowing my temper, he thinks I'm never gonna see him again. He thought he was safe."
The killing of Bruno unleashed a cascade of bloodshed, as if someone had pulled his finger from the dike of festering jealousy and greed that had built during Bruno's long reign atop the family. Among the first to die were the minor league Machiavellis behind the Bruno hit, their fates determined immediately by the mob's ruling commission. Everyone must die. The death sentences were meant both as retribution for the killing of one of their own, and a harsh reminder to one and all that the unsanctioned murder of a boss violated one of the Mafia's most sacrosanct laws, even if the murder was done with a wink and a nod of approval from within. The Genovese family, when the commission met to discuss the Bruno murder, immediately volunteered to exact revenge for the hit. It was a brilliant move. The very family that cleverly put the whole mess in motion would now clean things up, ensuring that Caponigro would never get a chance to tell the story of his meeting with Thierry or plead his case with one of the other four bosses. Tony Bananas remained clueless about his fate, unaware that he had unwittingly signed his own death warrant by pulling the shotgun trigger on that Philadelphia night. 3 weeks later, Thierry sent word to Caponigro that he was wanted in New York City. A call was made to a designated payphone in Newark, just a few blocks from Tony Banana's bar, with the summons. Caponigro had anticipated the invitation from the day that his plot to kill Bruno began. The crowning of a new king was at hand. His right-hand man, Freddy Salerno, had answered the ringing phone. Genovese boss Chin Gigante was sending a car for Caponigro and Salerno, arriving at 1 p.m. to bring the men into the city. The Chin himself would be waiting, along with Thierry. The voice at the other end was abrupt, providing only the bare-bones details. Without waiting for a reply, the man abruptly hung up. Salerno was offended by the rudeness of the call, making him wonder if the coronation was actually something else. He kept his concerns to himself, convinced that it was nothing more than mob-induced paranoia, and began his walk back to the bar and his boss. Caponigro waited impatiently for Salerno's return, checking the time on his pricey Piaget watch. The excitement rose within him, as it had each day since the killing, that today was the day Caponigro had waited for his entire life. At 11:30 a.m., Salerno found his boss standing in the doorway of the bar, awaiting Salerno's return, the door's handle in his hand as he looked up the Newark street. From 30 feet away, Salerno flashed a smile and a thumbs up to Caponigro, now with a look of childlike delight on his weathered face. "Tony, it will be today," the herald announced in an excited voice that belied his concerns about what exactly this day would hold. But Salerno's worries were entirely his own. Caponigro, blinded by visions of his imminent ascension, thought only about the car coming from New York to pick them up. It couldn't arrive soon enough to suit him. The ensuing ride was all that separated him from the seat atop the Philadelphia Mafia. Forgotten was the old mob maxim: you cannot kill a boss unless the entire commission gives its approval, the key word being entire. Caponigro, hearing what he wanted to hear, went forward only on the say-so of the clever Thierry. What was done could not be undone, and the pricey sedan dispatched by the Chin headed west from Greenwich Village toward Newark. The car arrived 5 minutes early, with the Chin's trusted bodyguard Vinny DeMaio, dispatched as the Genovese family emissary. Caponigro bounded from the club toward the car, with Salerno respectfully walking a few steps behind. Both were dressed to the nines, two real men of La Cosa Nostra, going in style. DeMaio led them to the waiting car. The passengers expected to head toward Gigante's grubby Greenwich Village clubhouse, but DeMaio explained their destination was instead a Brooklyn waterfront warehouse owned by the family. The Bruno murder had turned up the heat in New York as well as in Philadelphia, he explained. The Chin's Triangle Club was now under constant FBI surveillance, and the arrival of anyone connected to the Philly family would immediately stamp them as suspects in the execution. Caponigro nodded his assent at the change in plans. The Manhattan skyline loomed in the distance as the ride continued in silence. They arrived in Brooklyn within an hour, pulling in front of a gray waterfront building with a stark metal gate. The entrance was flanked by two large thugs. One pressed a red button, and the door slowly cranked open for the car to pull inside. The sedan stopped about 20 feet away from a group of men whose faces were indistinguishable in the dim warehouse light. DeMaio and the driver exited, stepping aside into the shadows as the voice of Thierry echoed through the dank building. The reality of the situation suddenly hit Caponigro. This was the end, not the beginning.
"Tony, come over here,"
Thierry beckoned.
"Vincent is in the rear office. We'll go together."
As Natale heard the tale, Caponigro turned and apologized to his old friend Salerno for putting him in the middle of this disaster.
"If I have to go, I couldn't go with a better man,"
Salerno replied. Caponigro's body was found on April 18, 1980 in the South Bronx. The treacherous Capo's corpse bore mute testimony to the gauntlet of violence that comprised his last moments of life. He was beaten, strangled, stabbed, shot. The corpse, stuffed inside a mortuary body bag, showed signs of torture. There was one other discovery. $300 and $20 bills were found stuffed in his mouth and up his ass. Salerno's body, in a similarly gruesome state, was found the same day about 4 miles away with the same cash deposit. He'd taken 3 bullets behind the right ear and 1 more behind the left. Most of the bones in his face were broken, and rope burns were on his neck, wrists, and ankles. The message was clear. These 2 men were killed by their own greed. It took 6 months to track down Sindone ally Johnny Keys Simone, a cousin of Bruno's whose specific role in the hit is as unclear as the penalty for his part was obvious. The mobster, in hiding since the murder, was lured to his death by the promise that his penalty would be an exile from Philadelphia to his vacation home in sunny Florida. The hit was done by the Gambino family, with Simone's body found in a wooded area of Staten Island. He had 2 last requests. Simone wanted to be killed by a made man, and he wanted his shoes taken off. Simone had once promised his wife that he would die barefoot. Both requests were honored by future Gambino family underboss Sammy the Bull Gravano. This left only Sindone, who had bolted from Philadelphia for his beachfront condo in California to weather the upcoming storm in the sunshine. He was armed with a bogus ID and some credit cards issued under an alias in case his West Coast stay lasted longer than anticipated. Sindone's whereabouts were known to just one man, his protege, Joseph Chicky Ciancaglini. The strapping mob enforcer handled collections for Sindone, but he was now listening to the new boss, Philip Testa. The last plotter proved the most elusive of the targets, even as the hunt for the traitor began within a week of the killing. Testa, on the advice of his new consigliere Scarfo, called Ciancaglini to a meeting where the 2 new family executives planned to squeeze Sindone's pal for information. Ciancaglini knew what was what, and they didn't have to squeeze too hard. Ciancaglini was taking phone calls from Sindone every other day at a gas station payphone. The fugitive mafioso was looking for absolution from Testa and was willing to surrender all of the family's loan sharking business in return for a pass. Ciancaglini considered his options. Most important, he worried that his ties to Sindone might lead the new regime to suspect his complicity in the killing. The thought rattled in his head as Ciancaglini drove to meet with Testa and Scarfo within a week of the murder. The get-together was set for a South Philly row house belonging to Frank Monti, who ran the family's numbers operation. Nobody lived in the house, which was used as a drop for the day's business. Ciancaglini knocked with some apprehension before Monty opened the door and let him inside. The 45-foot walk from the entrance to the kitchen was the longest of Ciancaglini's life. Scarfo stood for a handshake to welcome their guest, as Natale later heard the tale.
"I'm glad you came so quickly," said Scarfo. "I told Phil that you wouldn't hesitate."
Ciancaglini extended one hand toward little Nicky. In the other, he held Sindone's lone bargaining chip, 2 small leather-bound composition books filled with all the details of his now doomed friend's street money. Testa pulled out a chair for Ciancaglini to take a seat and offered their visitor something to eat. An array of cold cuts, Sicilian bread, and Jersey tomatoes sat on the table before them. Ciancaglini didn't have much of an appetite.
"Phil,"
he quickly declared, "I had nothing to do with what happened to Ange, on my mother's soul." Testa offered his hand in a smile, enough to convince Ciancaglini that he would leave the row house on his own 2 feet rather than inside a rolled-up carpet.
"We know,"
Testa finally replied.
"Nicky already said word to New York that you're in the clear, and that you will help us bring in this motherfucker Sindone for what he allowed those other 2 motherfuckers to do."
The whole thing had a certain irony. Sindone had agreed to set up the man who'd facilitated his rise through the family, and now Ciancaglini, whose position in the family was the result of his friendship with Sindone, would give up his own benefactor. He turned over the 2 books, and as a bonus revealed where Sindone stashed his petty cash, which was hardly petty at all.
"This is the true mantra of La Cosa Nostra,"
Natale observed ruefully years later, after all his mob illusions were reduced to dust. When the gas station phone rang the next day, the plan was set in motion. The plotters bided their time until their target was finally swayed, convinced it was safe to come home. Sindone's body, stuffed inside 2 green plastic trash bags, was found dumped behind a South Philadelphia billiard parlor and supermarket on October 30th, 1980. He was shot 3 times in the head. While the mob meted out its retribution for the Bruno murder, one of the murderous cabal was already in the wind: John Stanfa. The Sicilian knew his role in the killing was fairly common knowledge. What few others knew was that his uncle John Gambino knew in advance of the mob hit, filled in by Stanfa the mole after Caponigro approached Bruno's driver. Both were in danger of facing the same sentence as the other connivers. Stanfa reached out to his fellow Zips in New York for a helping hand. Gambino faced a dilemma. He could either kill Stanfa or save his Sicilian kin's ass. He opted for the latter. Stanfa was spirited south to a job in a Maryland pizzeria, his reward for taking down a Don now nothing more than kneading dough and working an oven. It took 9 months, but the authorities tracked Stanfa down in December, after John Gambino placed an anonymous call to the feds. When asked by FBI agents why he went to New York after the Bruno hit, Stanfa replied in broken English, "To get a cup of coffee. It's a free country, isn't it?" He was tried and convicted of perjury for lying to a grand jury about his meeting with Sindone and Caponigro. Stanfa was sentenced to 6 years of federal time, which undoubtedly saved his life. He was now beyond the reach of the mob hierarchy and his own uncle, who might embrace a Sicilian-style change of heart toward the backstabbing Stanfa. The Bruno assassination shook the long, stable family to its core, sending the once rock-solid organization into a long spiral of treachery, incompetence, betrayal, murder, prosecution, and paranoia. Bodies were soon piling up on the South Philly streets and beyond, 24 in 5 years by one count, as 4 bosses followed Bruno into the chair over the next 15 years. No one could reverse the family's plummeting fortunes, and all wound up dead or behind bars. 18. Rise of the Chicken Man. With Caponigro's claim to the throne dispatched in a brutal fashion, underboss Testa took over as head of the Philadelphia mob. His reign was ended in less than a year by one of the most notorious hits in the mob's long and bloody history. Natale, from the start, never saw Testa as the right man for the lofty position.
"He looked the part, a fearsome countenance, and he had proven his worth as underboss because of his loyalty to Ange," Natale said. "But his loyalty was not enough to prevent the killing of his boss. When such men are forced by circumstance to take the reins, It is only with good fortune that disasters do not occur.
Phil Testa had exactly 12 months of good fortune ahead of him. Nicky Scarfo had a lot to do with it when the Chicken Man's luck ran out. Scarfo's hopes of ever rising under the Bruno regime were nil. The old boss shunted little Nicky to exile in his own personal Elba of Atlantic City, after a series of catastrophes, including the fatal stabbing of a longshoreman over a diner seat at the end of a long, boozy night with Chucky Merlino. Scarfo became capo of the Seagulls and Sand.
The devil,
Natale hisses of the Atlantic City gangster.
Pure evil. Boss only by attrition.
Natale never liked or trusted Scarfo, and the feeling was mutual. Ralph went to Bruno with a plan to murder Scarfo, a mission he viewed as a surgeon would the removal of a cancerous organ that threatened the entire body.
Nicky Scarfo hated me,
Natale recalled.
'Cause he knew I wanted to kill him. He did. Angelo Bruno made me swear to him, face to face, that I wouldn't do it. The truth of the matter is, he told me, no, you can't. His two uncles came over here and helped fight in the old war and this and that. Why did I want to kill him? Because of what he is. I knew he was in Atlantic City talking to other people. He's gonna cause a problem.
In the early 70s, the two men had a run-in over control of Local 54, representing the Seaside Resort's hotel and restaurant workers. Scarfo had befriended the union's president, Frank Garacci, and tried to lay claim to the labor boss. Natale, backed by the Chicago, New York, Philadelphia triumvirate, was then merging the Atlantic City Local with his own Local 170. Why?
One reason, Natale explained. To be in complete control if and when gambling came to Atlantic City.
Scarfo registered a beef over Natale's intrusion into his business, and quickly wound up on the losing end of the debate. Angelo Bruno squashed Scarfo's bid for control, firmly ruling that Natale was in complete control of the mob's union interests in Atlantic City. The two unions would eventually become one. Natale knew that Scarfo was a bitter man with a long memory, and the animosity between the two men lingered. Natale had little use for Scarfo as either a mafioso or a man, as he made clear decades later.
Nicky Scarfo is a sick, demented man. I'm sorry I listened to Ange, but he made me swear. It was a personal thing. He said it would kill the uncles. I told him, go to Sicily for a couple weeks, go take a trip, just leave it to me. And he said, you can't do that.
With Bruno now gone and Natale locked up, Scarfo's eyes were refocused on the prize. Boss of the family, king of Atlantic City. Even on the night when the commission anointed Testa, the South Jersey mobster worked the room inside the executive suite at the ritzy St. Regis Hotel as if he were one of their peers. The sight was enough to send a shiver through Testa's soul, despite his rise to the lofty spot, succeeding his old friend Bruno. He felt like an outsider among these New York men who are now his equals. Even his outfit, an expensive but simple suit, seemed out of place on this night of nights. Part of the blame belonged to the late Bruno, who kept Testa close to himself and far away from the mob's hierarchy beyond the Philadelphia city limits. But Testa was cheered by his new consigliere Scarfo's friendship with the New Yorkers, believing his loyal pal's ties would benefit Testa's reign. And his spirits were boosted by a conversation with Gambino boss Castellano that left both bosses smiling. Big Paul had reminded him of the pact made by their predecessor when it came to looting Atlantic City and its unions. But it was not Castellano who welcomed Testa to the boss's ranks, a subtle sign of the shifting alliances already underway. Bobby Manna stood instead, a glass of champagne in his hand, as the other bosses sat around a large table to welcome Testa.
To the new boss of the Philadelphia family, Phil Testa,
the Genovese consigliere declared to the clinking of glasses. There were handshakes and hugs of welcome and congratulations, along with the promise of help, if needed, in restoring order to the new Testa family. The thoughts of Scarfo, from his seat in the same suite, were already drifting to the next morning in Atlantic City. He was also busily compiling a mental hit list with one name at the top, John McCullough. Natale knew exactly what Scarfo was thinking.
Now that Ange is gone and Ralphie's buried in Lewisburg, their ends of Atlantic City come directly to us. There's no one left to come to us for what used to be Ralphie's.
Scarfo shared his thoughts with the new boss on their ride home from Manhattan, holding the promise of fast cash from Local 54's health and welfare pension funds as a carrot for Testa. The money was particularly enticing for Testa, whose previous earnings were dependent on his ties to the late Bruno. Scarfo appeared poised to open a spigot flowing with riches. On the morning after the commission officially installed Testa, Little Nicky summoned union boss Garachi to his home, an invitation delivered by the terrifying Virgilio. Scarfo appeared in a robe and slippers, while his guest stood as a show of respect to the newly promoted gangster. He sat in the kitchen near the lone window, where an unusually high cinder-block wall blocked the sunshine. There was a tale behind the wall's construction. Scarfo contracted for its creation over fears that Natale might one day pay an early morning visit to resolve their feud with a few hollow points, ignoring Bruno's orders to the contrary. Scarfo offered Garachi a smile that belied the glare in his eyes. He explained that the union now belonged to him, and promised a larger cut of the cash to the union head. Garachi, who had a wife, kids, and a mistress to support, saw a vision of the future. No financial worries. His girlfriend, now working in his office, set up in a home of her own, free to work only on her tan and taut physique. A steady stream of cash as the union membership exploded from 700 dues-paying members to more than 20,000. Garachi's role was simple. In addition to access to the union money, he would arrange for a consulting firm to find companies that would handle various union duties. The businesses would pay dearly for the access, and the money would come back to the mob. It sounded too good to be true, mostly because it was. By 1982, the New York Times was already reporting Garachi's ties to the Scarfo crew. Subtlety was not among Scarfo's limited charms. On this March morning in 1980, such concerns were not part of the agenda. Scarfo envisioned the same windfall as Garachi, who would enjoy the ear of Phil Testa, whose knowledge of the free-flowing cash would come only from the lying mouth of his new consigliere. The future seemed bright, with the promise of fast cash for the family. None of it was going to Natale, one of the architects of the mob's grip on the revitalized seaside resort. It would take only a few short years for Scarfo to undo what was so carefully put in place by the prescient bosses of New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia.
Testa failed to see the obvious, that the foundation of Atlantic City, the Union, was now in the hands of his murderous partner, Nicky Scarfo, Natale said in hindsight.
Scarfo's plan had a second part. As Natale knew, this was not a man to let bygones be bygones. The new consigliere was plotting his revenge on all those who'd left him to rot in the wasteland of Atlantic City, as they whispered in Bruno's ear.
He wanted them to feel what he felt in all those damp, cold years before gambling came to Atlantic City, Natale said, before Angelo Bruno was killed.
The Atlantic City of 1980 was a burgeoning mob wonderland when Scarfo invited the new boss for a visit. Little Nicky was behind the wheel as the two men drove to the resort's international casino, the first of the gambling meccas to rise alongside the Atlantic Ocean. The two men entered the lobby side by side, with Testa marveling at the Carrera marble and plush carpeting. Scarfo's nephew Leonetti walked a respectful step behind the pair. Slightly ahead waited the hulking Garachi, who lived in mortal fear of the 5'5" Scarfo. Unlike his predecessor Bruno, the new boss was unused to the position of power that he now held. Bruno was a true peer of the old New York bosses and the outfit in Chicago. Testa was still feeling his way around. Garachi shook hands with the new Don as he looked directly at Scarfo, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Garachi led the visitors on a tour of the premises. As they walked, Scarfo got down to the business he really wanted to discuss. John McCullough, the popular head of the Roofers Union Local 33. Scarfo broached a subject he had raised before, that another union was nosing around Atlantic City and threatening their stranglehold on the casino business. He laid out a grim scenario for Testa. McCullough was trying to organize the city's bartenders to form their own union, with their own business agents. They would operate outside Garachi's sphere of influence. No money from this group would find its way west to Philadelphia.
How the hell did this happen?
Testa asked. Scarfo had a ready answer. McCullough had the backing of his fellow Irishman, the powerful union boss, and old Natale ally, Ed Hanley. How the fuck did our friends in Chicago give the green light to Hanley to allow this to happen? Testa shot back. The explanation was simple. As long as the outfit got paid each month, they couldn't care less about which union provided the cash. In time, Geraci explained, outsiders could take over Local 54 and turn off the flow of money to Philadelphia. While initially enraged by the blunt talk, Scarfo soon realized it was to his benefit. McCullough was atop the first wave of interlopers and needed to be stopped right away. He asked for a moment alone with Testa.
"Phil, we can't allow them Irish motherfuckers to take all of this away,"
said Scarfo, waving his arm toward the jangling slot machines and busy gaming tables.
"Too many people have worked at this. It belongs to us. The Philly family needs to show we can police our own territory and protect what is ours."
Testa reacted with emotion, rather than the patience and consideration needed in such a situation. The boss, standing inside the first floor of the casino, approved a contract for Scarfo to murder McCullough. The decision had repercussions that the new boss could never imagine. The contract was given to the dapper Martirano, suddenly a part of Scarfo's murderous inner circle after all those years with Bruno as his partner. 9 days before Christmas 1980, a flower delivery man knocked on the door of McCullough's home, carrying an armful of holiday poinsettias. McCullough was talking on the phone as his wife stood in the kitchen watching when the visitor dropped the flowers and opened fire. McCullough was shot 6 times and died right in front of his horrified wife.
"Shameful,"
Natale said of the killing.
"A complete disregard of La Cosa Nostra rules of killing any man. In front of his family. John McCullough was as courageous and tough a man as ever put on a pair of pants. A Marine and a World War II hero."
Nicky Scarfo was just getting started. 19. They blew up the Chicken Man. Shortly after Testa's ascension, he selected a longtime Philly mob figure as his underboss, family capo Pete Casella, a convicted heroin dealer who did 17 years behind bars without ever opening his mouth, a true stand-up guy from the mob's old guard. Before the appointment became official, Casella visited the stone-front home of Frank Chicky Narducci on South Broad Street, where the host's wife, Adeline, poured coffee and offered to make breakfast. Casella politely declined, and the two men began to talk. They had a shared history. Narducci had come to Casella's aid when the mob veteran returned to Philly after doing his drug rap time.
"Chicky admired him," Natale explained. "Casella was known in the family at one time as the number 2 hatchet man, right behind Skinny Razor. Chicky told him, 'You come with me.' He set him up on the outside with new clothes and an apartment."
This meeting was about the present, not the past. Narducci broached the idea of Casella's appointment to the number 2 spot. Casella replied that Job 1 was taking care of Bruno's killers. Job 2 was making sure Scarfo didn't get the underboss position. "I give you my word," Casella declared, "that little snake Scarfo will never be what he thinks he will be. The best he will get is the number 3 spot. If for any reason this does not come about, then, and only then, you and I will talk again." The two men hugged as Narducci's nervous wife made the sign of the cross for both of them in another room. Casella's prediction on the new arrangement of the family hierarchy was spot on. His promotion was met with approval by the made men of Philadelphia and the bosses of New York. The lone dissenting voice was Scarfo, relegated to the family's number 3 spot, but he made no public pronouncement of his feelings. For Natale, the Chicken Man's choices for the top spots provided further evidence of the new boss's chief failure after assuming the seat of power. Casella and Scarfo had little use for one another, creating a schism at the very inception of the new regime.
"It's like you never heard or read the old axiom, 'Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it,'" said Natale. "In his haste to appease all the factions of the family, he made a grave mistake in his choices as underboss and consigliere. He failed to recognize the Bruno killing had shattered the aura of invincibility that surrounded the men who rule and set free the demons of unrealistic ambitions and the greed of men who wanted to be more than they were ever born to be."
Testa's biggest fault was putting even an ounce of trust in his friend and consigliere Scarfo.
He was a non-entity until Angelo Bruno was murdered, and then he fell into the role he was born to play, a sycophant who took advantage of Testa. The face of the Philly mob was transformed from the benevolent profile of Bruno into the face of greed and treachery embodied by Scarfo. As Willie Shakespeare would say, therein lies the problem.
Testa stood flanked by his two choices for the ruling troika inside the dimly lit basement of a South Philly row house as the family conducted its swearing-in ceremony for its new leaders. The smell of damp mortar mingled with the smoke from burning candles. Testa, looking every inch the rightful successor as Padrone, wore a dark gray pinstriped suit. Through the flickering candlelight, he could make out the face of his son Salvi, there to witness the installation of the new boss, the young man's father. The pride was obvious on both their faces. The ceremony would also include the induction of new members into the family, including the younger Testa. For many, his arrival as a made man marked Salvi's designation as heir apparent.
"Salvi was the prince-in-waiting,"
said Natale, who'd known the young Testa since the new inductee was a boy.
"He was a gangster's gangster. He had the DNA. Pure. He tasted the power, growing up the way he did. And once you feel that, it's hard to get rid of. It's like heroin. End of story."
Sworn in alongside Salvi were Scarfo's nephew, Crazy Phil Leonetti, Salvatore Wayne Grande, Anthony Blonde Babe Pungitore, Chicky Narducci's son Frank, and two others. Salvi and Leonetti invited the new inductees and the rest to join them for an after-party at the Saloon, a bar-restaurant in the oldest and most heavily Italian section of the city. Pungitore's oldest son, Joe, helped ferry the revelers to their celebration. Salvi Testa was the main attraction, drawing an admiring crowd of male mob wannabes and attractive young women, including Maria Merlino, whose father, Chucky, would later move into the family's ruling hierarchy. The men shared a dinner served promptly at 8 p.m. and toasted one another with champagne and iced vodka as the gawkers stared. The very public meeting was meant as a dual statement of purpose. Here we are, and the city belongs to us. Casella, who'd received his button 40 years earlier, was the only one to turn down the invitation. "I love you," the ever-respectful Salvi told his old man at the ceremony, planting a kiss on his cheek. "And I'm at your service no matter what." The pre-party event struck Natale years later as among the most ironic gatherings in Philly mob history. All assembled pledged allegiance to the family and the new dawn, including Casella and Scarfo.
Here, standing together while swearing a vow of loyalty, were the men who within a few short years would break every promise, including the oath of omertà to Phil Testa and La Cosa Nostra,
Natale said of the ceremony.
"Never in the history of the family was a ceremony so ripe with men who would be a part of killing one another."
The first to turn against all odds was the veteran Casella. Among Casella's friends was local hood Rocco Marinucci, who in turn had a pal named Teddy Di Pretoro, a waiter at Bookbinders, a popular seafood restaurant on the Delaware River. The two aspiring gangsters did a bit of drug dealing, and Marinucci was particularly determined to become a made man. Di Pretoro boasted a talent for manufacturing silencers, bombs, and assorted other weaponry in his basement. Casella was soon accompanied everywhere by the young hoodlums, as Scarfo connived to omit the underboss from his discussions with Testa and keep the elder mobster in the dark about the Atlantic City money. What Scarfo forgot was that the Philly mob veteran had friends inside the Gambino family too, men who had done time in Atlanta alongside Casella. Casella's eyes were opened during a New York social call with his old cellmates. Accompanied by Narducci, Casella checked into the St. Regis Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for a weekend reunion in January 1981. Tommy Bellotti, one of Boss Castellano's most trusted men, invited the pair to a small Sunday dinner gathering at a tiny Italian restaurant closed to all but the mobsters. Each table was covered by a checkered tablecloth, a sight right out of every mob movie ever made about New York. Bellotti brought one other guest, a Gambino captain jailed alongside Casella. The The man would vouch for both Bilotti and Casella, an old mafia tradition, since the two had never met. Dinner was served, but this was a business meeting as well.
Tommy Bilotti was a tough guy,
Natale said, a Big Paul's right-hand man.
If he had something to say, he said it, no questions asked. Paul Castellano needed someone like him.
Once the formalities were finished, Bilotti congratulated Casella on his promotion to underboss. He also offered his compliments on the windfall that came with the new position, the buckets of cash liberated from the funds of Local 54. It was the first that Casella or Narducci had ever heard about the money that was already coming the way of Testa and Scarfo.
When he heard the money was supposed to be shared equally between Castellano, Philly, and Chicago, he wasn't getting a dime,
Natale recounted of the meeting.
He was dumbfounded. Being the man he is, he always played it straight. And that's what he said, we gotta do something now. That's what ignited the whole plot against Phil Testa. Casella thought, I've got to get something out of this, even if it's just 3 cents. That's the evilness of our life. The greed with people saying, hey, that guy, he don't need this, he don't need that.
Casella made it through the meal before excusing himself, mentioning a meeting scheduled that night in Philadelphia with Testa. The two old gangsters shared an embrace, with Bilotti sending along greetings to both the new boss and his son, Salvi. Bilotti had earlier shared his private number with Casella, and he urged the Philly-made man to use it, particularly if there was any trouble with Scarfo.
Keep your eyes and ears open for anything, Bilotti said in parting. These are dangerous times for the Philadelphia family after a man like Angelo Bruno was murdered by his own.
Casella was reeling as he walked outside the restaurant under the gray city sky. The two Philly vets climbed into their car for the ride home, with Narducci at the wheel. Not now, Casella said with a wave of his hand, calling for silence as they drove through the crowded Manhattan streets. But both men were considering the treachery exposed over dinner, and they both believed something had to be done about this disrespectful slap in the face.
So be it,
Casella finally said, more to himself than Narducci, and let out a sigh. This was Pete Casella's pinpoint in time, riding along the turnpike back to his hometown. 2/3 of the family's ruling triumvirate had treated him like a fool, hoarding the income from Atlantic City for themselves. The sting of this realization soon evolved into anger and vengeance before Casella finally shared his thoughts with Narducci.
Chicky, when we enter Philly, we go into town as when we left, knowing nothing about Atlantic City and what we were told. Then we call Rocco and tell him to bring the kid who's the expert with the guns and bombs.
Narducci turned to look at his friend.
Can I say something now? I've never been happier than at this moment.
The exchange marked the beginning of the end for Testa, barely 10 months into his reign as boss. To the men driving south, Phil Testa was already a dead man walking. Narducci wasn't done. He wanted to take out Scarfo as well and proposed that he personally pump 2 bullets into Little Nicky's head. Casella remained focused on Testa, knowing that the New York bosses would be outraged by a second unsanctioned Philly killing so close to the murder of Bruno. A plot soon evolved. They would make the mob hit appear as payback for the murder of Union boss McCullough, which was backed by Testa. Casella and Narducci were actually sharing dinner on the night of the McKellar murder, with news of the assassination personally delivered to their table by the restaurant's owner. McCullough's friends in the Union and his allies in the Irish Republican Army would shoulder the blame. Because the IRA was famously proficient with bombs, they would detonate an explosive device and blow Testa to kingdom come. De Pretoro and Marinucci met with the underboss and Narducci at the Villa di Roma, a restaurant in the heart of the Italian market. The traitorous quartet made their plans and pledged their mutual allegiance. The sands were now running quickly from the hourglass of Testa's life. The murder weapon would be a keg filled with roofer's nails placed atop sticks of dynamite. De Pretoro would design the simple bomb using 20 sticks of dynamite, and Marinucci would hit the detonator. On March 15th, 1981, 6 days short of the first anniversary of Bruno's demise, the two men sat inside a van parked near Testa's upscale home. At 2:55 a.m., the chicken man walked toward the front door after double parking his 1980 Chevrolet Caprice Classic on the street. A massive explosion tore suddenly through the night. a blast so powerful that the porch was torn to pieces and debris scattered for 50 feet across the property. The front door was blown 30 feet into the kitchen, with an 8-foot-wide hole torn in the front facade of the house. Testa was pronounced dead a short time later at St. Agnes Hospital. The cops found $10,000 cash in his pockets. "He looked like he went through a giant paper shredder," said one eyewitness. The bomb plot had worked, too. Media reports soon suggested the killers were friends of McCullough's exacting revenge. Natale was less surprised by the second murder of a Philadelphia boss in just under a year.
Pure La Cosa Nostra, finding a reason to justify killing a one-time friend, he reflected. Although in this case it was not hard, considering the treachery involved with Atlantic City.
When law enforcement searched Testa's home, they found a VCR and just 2 tapes, The Godfather, Parts 1 and 2. As he had 1 year earlier after the Bruno murder, Scarfo called his old prison pal Manna from the Genovese family. This time, he was plotting to fill the suddenly vacant seat as head of the volatile Philly family, where decades of peace were forgotten after their second brutal execution. This time, the killers were Pete Casella and Chicky Narducci, Scarfo told his friend. Only days later, Scarfo's nephew Phil Leonetti was standing alongside an Atlantic City payphone inside an Italian restaurant at 6 p.m., the designated number for the Genovese family to hear from Little Nicky. Leonetti had driven a few short blocks to the location, ensuring no one could lob a shot at him on the streets. The call was short and the message terse. Leonetti was wanted at 10 a.m. the next day in Manhattan. Make sure nobody is following you. Click. Leonetti arrived 30 minutes early with a burly doorman leading him inside a luxurious condo on the Upper East Side. His uncle had briefed Leonetti the night before, and the young gangster took the elevator to the 4th floor, where he was greeted by Manna's muscle, 2 men the size of Mack trucks. A third man greeted him by name and led Leonetti inside, where Manna awaited. The apartment was redolent of Italian coffee and Cuban cigars. Leonetti entered and kissed his host on both cheeks. Casella might somehow have reached the Genovese family before Scarfo, but the die was already cast. All the fears were dispersed as Manna began to speak. His message as clear as the church bells ringing on a Sunday morning back in South Philly. Manna offered his condolences for the killing of Testa. The Genovese family was on board with Scarfo's version of what happened, and so was the entire commission, now fully under the sway of the Chin's powerhouse family. The Philadelphia branch was placed in the hands of a murderous psychopath, Little Nicky Scarfo. Blood would flow, and the family soon flailed.
Bobby Manna set loose what Scarfo had kept dormant in the darkest part of his soul,
Natale mused years later.
The bitterness of those years when he was regarded by Angelo Bruno and his fellow made men as unstable in his dealings with other men. Manna based his opinions on the years when they walked a yard in New Jersey, where Scarfo hid his devious nature behind a verbiage of flattery that distracted Bobby from digging any deeper.
Natale recalled a time when Scarfo's stock was so low that the city's top drug dealers spurned his company and turned up their noses when he called to distribute their product and line his pockets. Now, Scarfo decreed they would pay his family tribute or face the lethal consequences. Any drug dealers who balked would face a death sentence with no appeal.
He unleashed a bloodbath without reason or direction, said Natale. He did this for only one purpose, to instill fear in the hearts of enemies created only by his own paranoia, and also in the minds of his own newly baptized soldiers.
Scarfo made one other move. He brought Bruno's old partner, Martorano, into the family as a made man. The docile Don had refused his friend's requests for 2 decades, but in April 1981, Martorano received his button along with Salvatore Shotzi Sparaccio. Martorano, as a meth maker himself, knew all the other major players in the drug game and shared his wealth of industry knowledge with the new boss. Martorano also agreed within a month to serve up 2 of his best friends from their mutual business, Harry Petros and Stevie Boras, members of the city's so-called Greek mob, an affiliation of about a dozen that also dealt in gambling and loan sharking.
Long John became a made man on the bodies of his friends, recounted Natale with disdain. And he never even pulled the trigger.
Petros and Long John were business partners and friends, often dining together, Marturano with his wife, and the Greek with his girlfriend du jour. Marturano had broached the idea of partnering with Scarfo to Petros, who brushed aside the suggestion as the two shared what became their final meal, with an appetizer of beluga caviar and champagne at a 5-star restaurant. "You gotta be kidding," said Petros. "I'll gladly send him an envelope every month out of respect, but I put my balls on the line all my life, and now he wants to emasculate me?" Marturano appeared confused until Petros gave him the definition of emasculate. "He wants to take my manhood away from me." The two men excused themselves from the table to continue their conversation, with Marturano lending a sympathetic ear to his old pal. "Harry, I'll fix this," he said confidently. "The monthly thing will be enough. Let's go over and join our ladies." Once seated, Long John reached into an ice bucket to remove a chilled bottle of vodka. He poured the booze into a pair of snifters and raised his glass in a toast. "To tonight, and forever our friendship." Petros, who usually picked up the tab for their nights on the town, was only the first to die. 2 nights after their dinner, his body was found inside the trunk of his gold Cadillac on May 25, 1981. His last ride ended when the luxury car was parked on a quiet street about a mile outside the city limits. He died secure with Marturano's assurance that his decision to stiff Scarfo would come without consequence. Natale said Petros's mistake was a failure to gauge the sudden change in Scarfo's mob stature, along with the everlasting enmity of Little Nicky toward those who had once looked down their noses at him, and Petros completely misjudged Marturano's relationship with the new boss.
He made a brave mistake because Long John was in deadly fear of this miniature gangster, said Natale.
The Petros killing came with a maniacal twist. Marturano arranged for Buras, his next target, to pull the trigger. Buras, kingpin of a multi-million-dollar methamphetamine ring, was recruited by a promise from Long John that the execution would ensure his independence from the Scarfo regime, along with control of Petros's drug business. Marturano played his business partner like a Stradivarius in what Natale called the Mafia Triangle. He explained the double dealing this way.
When there are 2 men who have the same friend and they both trust him, it was simple. Use one to kill the other. The reason? Survival.
Buras received a call for a dinner date 2 days later from Marturano. Long John was bringing his wife, and he arranged a dinner companion for Buras. Knowing of Buras's interest in an attractive South Philly woman named Jeanette Kuro, an invite was extended to her as well. On its face, the dinner appeared a nod of congratulations on a job well done in the Petros hit. Like so many other things in the world of La Cosa Nostra, the truth proved far more sinister. The couples, joined by some other guests, assembled at the Melitus restaurant on May 27th, a beautiful spring day, with temperatures in the low 70s. Marturano found his killer for this hit much closer to home, his troubled son, George. Natale recalled that George, known as Cowboy, struggled as a kid with an attention deficit disorder and relied on medication to control his condition. The son had never killed a man in his life, but his greedy father was more focused on his future in the crime family than worried about his own kin. As Natale heard the tale, Buras, a seasoned killer possessed of the sixth sense needed to survive in his treacherous business, was oblivious of the warning signs of impending doom as he turned all his attention toward Kuro. He never noticed when Marturano arranged the seating so that Buras was closest to the restaurant's entrance. Buras never saw the 2 men enter the restaurant through that front door until it was too late. Both shooters wore their winter clothes despite the warm weather, one in a ski mask and a long coat, the other with a wool scarf wrapped around his face. Come on now, fellas," said Buras when he saw the pair marching toward the table. Those were his final words. The younger Marturano and his dad's bodyguard started firing indiscriminately from 10 feet away, with the inexperienced Georgie emptying his weapon. The pair didn't stop shooting until Buras was dead. Killed alongside the meth dealer was his innocent date, Jeanette Kuro. Natale, though no stranger to the murderous ways of the mob, was repulsed when he heard the story.
A scene from hell. The father has his son kill a man in front of his mother, as simple as asking him to run an errand. Asking him to lose his immortal soul for the aspirations of the father to find the top position in the Philly family.
20. Life in Lewisburg. When Ralph arrived at Lewisburg, facing another quarter-century away from his hometown and the Philly mob, the dire circumstances of his life finally hit the gangster. Angelo Bruno was dead and gone, and so was the money once sent to Natale's family. His future appeared as dreary as the nondescript surroundings.
"You see them gray walls? You see them gun towers?" he recalled. "And you got a long sentence, and you say, 'Look where I gotta do this time, in the middle of Pennsylvania.'"
Oddly enough, he was struck by perhaps the lone bit of fatherly advice that Spike Natale had ever offered him. The old man, after sizing up his young son, saw a long prison stretch somewhere in the boy's adult future.
"My father didn't tell me too many things, but he told me this," Natale said before repeating the words verbatim. "I know you're going away for a long time at some point," Spike lectured him. "Remember one thing when it happens. It may sound harsh now, but remember this. You have to forget everything and everybody, your wife, your kids, your girl, everything. Because if you don't, you'll think about that every day, and when you come home, you'll be half a man. And they can't do that to you."
Another bit of prison counsel came from the facility's African-American inmates.
"As my black brothers used to tell their black brothers when they came in, it's too late to get scared now,"
Natale said. One visitor's day early on, his brother Michael arrived at the correctional facility with their mom. The two came through the front gate, enduring a weapons check on the way inside. This was a strange, alternate reality for solid citizen Michael, a successful musician, the lead trumpet player for Philly talk show host Mike Douglas's band, and a professor at Temple University. Ralph used to tease his straight-arrow sibling that they came from different parents.
"Mom, are you sure?"
he asked with Michael in listening range.
"Me and him?"
This time, a stunned Michael did the talking after sitting down with Ralph inside the drab Lewisburg visiting room.
"How can you do it? How can you stay here?"
Ralph's answer came back terse and true.
"Michael, I have no choice. I gotta stay here."
Before Michael could answer, their mother spoke to her imprisoned son in a voice heavy with disdain.
"Ralph, look at you."
But Natale cut her off before she could utter another syllable.
"Mom, I gotta tell you something before we get into this. I'm glad you made me what I am. You made me tough. I don't care what they do to me. I gotta tell you that right to your face."
When Michael left with their mother, he threw up outside the prison walls and never returned.
"And I can understand that,"
Natale said.
"I don't know if I ever got used to it, but it didn't bother me after a while. That's frightening."
The high school dropout became a reader behind bars, everything from reference books to Ernest Hemingway's classic novels.
"When I had nothing to do, I would read the dictionary, from the front to the back, from the back to the front. In jail, you got nothing to do. And if you're doing real time, you don't have a TV in your room. All you got is a cell. So I read incessantly, and I thought about things."
He also became a regular at the weekly Sunday masses behind the prison walls.
Billy DePasquale, the brother of Mad Dog DePasquale, he was the altar boy. But everyone was serious about it. We went to church. Nobody would dare sneer at you because a lot of good men went every Sunday. It was terrible to see such a nice man like the priest, a great guy, inside that prison.
On one memorable occasion, the Stone Killer became a man of peace, brokering a deal between the prison's black mafia and the prison administration. Complaints over living conditions led to a hunger strike by the African Americans, including a few doing life for the murders of 7 people inside a Washington, D.C. home owned by future NBA Hall of Famer Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Natale sat down with the inmates, then approached the prison guards.
"I just said, if you'll do this and that, the strike will be over,"
Natale recalled nonchalantly.
"And they did, and the strike ended. Whenever the black mafia had a beef after that, they came to me. And they remembered that."
No matter his other prison pursuits, Natale remained obsessed with avenging Bruno and taking control of the Philadelphia family.
"That was my quest, to take back Philadelphia from whoever was in charge, and to take back what once belonged to me and Angelo Bruno."
The scenario was never far from his thoughts. By 1982, the cash crunch created in the Natale household by Ralph's imprisonment was real and getting worse. Natale kept waiting for his old mob cohorts to do right by his family, but not a penny found its way to Lucia or the kids. When she came to visit Ralph, the two shared a fiscal summit to face the new realities.
I told her, we'll be okay. Sell the house. Sell the one in Palm Springs, too. And make sure the kids have enough to go to school, Natale remembered. You know what my wife did? She's a queen. She started cleaning other people's apartments, certain people that she liked. She cooked for them a little bit. She cleaned other people's toilets, and still I wouldn't become a rat. She took care of herself and sent me commissary money. Imagine that. I could cry when I think of it. But she did it.
His daughters, their father in prison, worked their way through school as waitresses. Natale, alone in his cell at night, asked for divine intervention to help him make it through.
I prayed to the Blessed Mother. I figured she's going to help me out, help my family out. Look, the things I did in my life, and I was still alive. There must have been somebody really cared for me.